bombardment of the Civil War, and I'll end just after that first bombardment in April of 1861. I do need to get through the talk quickly, so I'm going to ask you if you have questions, and please hold those until the end of my talk now, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions afterwards. I will stand around. I'll also be walking around the fort for the entire hour you're up here, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask then. And also, if you have any cell phones, if you could please turn those off or silence them, that would help me out a lot to avoid interruptions. And then if you'd like to walk away at any point to check out Fort Sumter on your own, feel free to do that. I'll not try and stop you, so if you want to walk away, you're welcome to do that. I may be sad. I won't be offended, though. I'll be all right. And we have another employee here today. She's an intern. Her name is Jill, and she'll be walking around the fort as well. She'll be presenting for the school group, but she's also here to answer any questions. If you have any questions at all, let us know. And Bob is the volunteer who rode on the boat with you. So with that being said, we'll get started. And Fort Sumter will start with the construction of the fort. This is a federal project that began in 1829. We just talked about this a little while earlier, but just to see if you were listening, why was Fort Sumter built? For what original purpose? For protection of the harbor, right? Against whom? Against foreign invaders. The Spanish still held colonies in the southeast. The British had the strongest navy in the world in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And to stop these foreign invaders from coming in and taking over an important port city like Charleston, this is why Fort Sumter is built. And it's a thoroughly federal project. The federal government contracted out all the labor and all the materials, not only to build Fort Sumter's walls, but also the island in which this fort stands. This is a man-made island that we're standing on today. And the construction of the island began in 1829. It took 17 years to build the island alone. It's a massive undertaking. It was built in about 10 feet of water. There's a submerged sandbar or shoal out here at the entrance to the harbor. It's just about 10 feet below the surface of the water, so it wasn't as deep as the main channel out there, about 50 or 60 feet. It still is a massive undertaking to build this island. It takes 100,000 tons of New England granite to build the mole, or the outer part of the island. And then the interior is filled in with sand from local riverbeds. And both free and enslaved laborers worked on the island for that 17 years. By the 1840s, by about 1846, the island was complete. It was relatively stable, and then work started on these brick walls. Today we are looking at the original brick walls, what's left of them. This is the brickwork that was done in the 1840s and the 1850s. The fort's walls were built for about 13 or 14 years, and mostly by skilled masons who were immigrants, it looks like from countries like Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, just judging by their last names on the contract list. But mostly white free laborers worked on the walls. And the materials they're working with, these bricks, had come from local plantations in the Charleston area, where they've been made by enslaved Africans and African Americans. About 3 million bricks were shipped from those sites out to this island, where these contractors worked on the walls. And the fort that they built was much more magnificent. It was a much more impressive structure than what we see in front of us today. It took 31 years to build the fort altogether. A lot of people ask, why did it take so long? But this was state-of-the-art military architecture. And once again, this was a huge project. So to get an idea of just how tall these walls were, look up there at those flagpoles. All right, the South Carolina state flag is that blue one in the middle. If you look on the pole, you'll might be able to see a ring about halfway up it. That's a red ring, and it marks exactly 55 feet. And that's approximately how tall these walls would have been as this project was nearing completion and just before war broke out. It was a much taller fort. It was divided into 3 different levels. Today we're left with this single tier. A lot of people ask why that is. That's because during the last 2 years of the Civil War, during Confederate occupation of Fort Sumter, the U.S. Army held an island to the south of here and heavily bombarded the fort, resulting in much of its destruction. And as those top 2 tiers were shot away, most of that rubble fell on top of this first tier and essentially preserved what we see in front of us. So that's why we have so little brickwork, but why it's in relatively good shape today, protected underneath all that rubble. But this was a very impressive fort. Most of the cannons that are here, there are 135 cannons planned for the fort. Most of the cannons didn't point east towards the Atlantic Ocean. Rather, they pointed north towards Sullivan's Island. And that may seem a little odd if it's built for the defense of the harbor to stop foreign navies from entering. But Fort Sumter had a commanding presence. With its guns pointing that way, it could work along with another fort. Does anybody know what the name of that fort is on Sullivan's Island? Yeah, good. Fort Moultrie. So Fort Moultrie is about a mile away from here, and it predates Fort Sumter by about 50 years. It was the site of the first major Patriot victory of the Revolutionary War in 1776. When Fort Sumter was built, about 50 years later, it was built as a complement to Fort Moultrie. So now ships entering through that channel had to pass between the two forts, and if those are enemy vessels, both sides could open fire and catch a ship in a crossfire. This is what Sumter was designed to do. Now, to accomplish that mission, Fort Sumter had guns like what we see closest to us today. This is a gun that was cast in the 1850s and probably brought here to Fort Sumter shortly afterwards. So it may have participated in the first bombardment of the Civil War. It's typical of Fort Sumter's armament at the start of the Civil War. To give you an idea of its range, its capabilities, it can fire a 42-pound cannonball about 1.5 miles was its maximum range. So it could easily span that distance to Fort Moultrie. Any ship in that channel was within range of Fort Sumter's guns. And a lot of people ask why this gun here is pointed back towards the city of Charleston. They'd possibly fire onto Charleston during the first bombardment. But during the first bombardment, this gun could fire 1.5 miles. Remember, the city of Charleston is about 3.5 miles away. This gun was purposely planted there, of course, for the defense of the harbor. It is on a flank wall. The idea is if any ship passed by the front of the fort, this left flank still needed to be able to fire onto any ship that slipped into the harbor. So this flank wall is a weaker wall, but it's still armed to stop any ships making their way towards the city. So this is always what Fort Sumter was designed to do. Now in 1860, almost all construction stopped on the fort is never officially completed by the federal government. 31 years of work never officially completed. And in 1860, we have a very important, a very controversial presidential election in the nation's history. And everybody should know who was elected president in 1860, right? You guys know who was elected?
Lincoln.
Yeah, Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln was elected. He's the first Republican president of the United States, as we know that party today, and that was primarily why he was so controversial. Because the Republican Party is a very young party. They were only 6 years old in 1860, and they had been formed as an anti-slavery party. What is the platform that Lincoln runs on regarding slavery? He takes a very specific anti-slavery stance.
Doesn't let it spread.
Right, he wants to stop the spread of slavery. Republicans also terminate the containment of slavery. What they're arguing is that the federal government has the authority to stop individual slaveholders from bringing their human property with them into new territories. And they say that slavery can exist where it already is, but it cannot spread any farther out west. So by extension, those western territories will most likely not become slave states. They'll become free states, which will disrupt the balance between the two. And that involves a lot of social, economic, political, and moral issues of the day related to slavery. Now, in response, many slave-holding states have said that they will secede from the Union should Lincoln become elected on this platform. South Carolina acted pretty quickly on its word to declare itself seceded just over a month after Lincoln's election. They declared themselves seceded on December 20th of 1860. When South Carolina seceded, that created a direct problem right here at Fort Sumter. One of the next big questions on everybody's mind was, who does all the federal property in the seceded state now belong to? Right, to make problems worse, there are already 85 U.S. Army men stationed in Charleston when South Carolina seceded. Those men were not here at Sumter. There are contractors still working out here. Instead, most of those Army men were over at Fort Moultrie. They were under the command of Major Robert Anderson, who was expected to hold on to all Army properties in Charleston during this crisis, which include both Forts Moultrie and Sumter, two additional forts in the harbor's interior, very close to the city. There's the site of Fort Johnson, which is to the west, about 1.25 miles in this direction, on James Island. And then there's Castle Pinckney, about 2 miles away, in the middle of the harbor. And finally, he had to hold on to an arsenal all the way downtown. 85 men, that was impossible. And Anderson was aware of that. 10 of his men were band musicians in the company bands. Trained to play drums and bugles, they're not trained to fire artillery. Anderson decided that the easiest thing to do, he felt his command was vulnerable over there at Moultrie. He moved his command here to Fort Sumter secretly on December 26th, not even 1 week after South Carolina had seceded. Well, the next afternoon, all of the men were safely inside of these walls. They then raised a huge United States flag on their flagpole, which was visible all the way downtown. And when that went up, that announced to Charlestonians that the U.S. Army is here inside the fort. Secessionists in the city were outraged and sent men out here immediately to ask Anderson to leave. They said he had no authority to move his command from Moultrie to Sumter. Anderson refused to move his command back to Moultrie. He said that he would stay here until the federal government ordered him to do so. In response, Charlestonians sent South Carolina militia and Citadel cadets from the military school downtown to all the other forts in the harbor which had been abandoned, and they seized them all for South Carolina, this new independent nation. What's important to remember is all this activity begins to happen. Is that neither side fires off a shot yet. Remember, we're in December of 1860, and both sides will try to compromise, will try to negotiate some sort of peaceful conclusion, but by April 12th, all those efforts have failed. April 12th of 1861. For the 4 months, they will try to work it out. Things really accelerate, not just here in the harbor, but nationwide over those 4 months. And 6 more states would secede following South Carolina, and they formed the Confederacy officially by March of 1861. And with the formation of the Confederacy, more Confederate troops started arriving here in Charleston Harbor. And historians estimate there are about 3,000 Confederate soldiers in the area when those first shots were fired. And those soldiers mostly start to concentrate on the islands within a 1.5-mile radius from Fort Sumter's walls, those older federal forts. There are soldiers downtown as well, but remember the range of these cannons, out of range, so should there be any sort of combat here in the harbor, the U.S. Army is right here at Fort Sumter. Confederate forces are going to be right within range of the walls, so if there's any sort of combat, they can be involved. And the Confederate Army needs somebody in charge of all their men. Who's the Confederate commander who's put in order, or who's put in charge here in March of 1861?
Beauregard.
Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, or PGT Beauregard from Louisiana. Beauregard arrives here in March. He starts to oversee all the Confederate activity in the harbor. He does send men out here on a couple occasions to see one last time if Anderson will give up his command here at Sumter. Anderson still refuses. And finally, on April 12th, Confederate forces just outside of Fort Johnson fire the first shot of the Civil War. After 4 months of holding fire, why do Confederate forces finally make that decision when they do?
Supplies were in.
Right, there are supply ships that were due to arrive here at Fort Sumter any day. And Anderson's men they're running very low on supplies. In fact, Anderson has told Beauregard that he will be starved out of here by April 15th. For the Confederate War Department, that is not good enough. The Confederate War Department is aware of a mission sent out under Lincoln's administration to resupply and reinforce Anderson's 85 men. And the Confederate War Department tells Beauregard not to let those supply ships into Fort Sumter. And on the 12th of April, word has arrived that those supply ships are nearing the harbor. Beauregard, early that morning, sends Anderson an ultimatum, telling him that he has 1 hour to get out of Fort Sumter, or Confederate forces will start bombardment. At 4:30 a.m., the U.S. Army is still inside these walls. Confederate forces just outside of Fort Johnson pull the lanyard on a 10-inch mortar, which fires a solitary signal shell high into the sky, which exploded almost perfectly over these parade grounds, that open area out behind you. And when that shell explodes, it's a signal for all other Confederate forces to open fire, which they do. Here at Fort Sumter, the U.S. Army holds its fire for about 2 hours. They are ordered to follow their regular routine, which includes sleeping in. It's highly unlikely that they sleep in. It's little. Having breakfast, and that had to have been pretty nerve-wracking then. And then at about 7 a.m. with daybreak, they start to return fire. Now, Anderson is trying to keep his men calm. That would have been very difficult to do. But also, he's trying to conserve his supplies. And he wants to make sure that his men fire off their shots correctly. So he has them, and that they're all safe. So he starts firing back at about 7 a.m. And from there, both sides exchange fire for a solid 34 hours, well over 1 day. Over 3,000 cannonballs were fired back and forth during the bombardment. How many people died during the bombardment?
None.
That's right. There were 0 fatalities, right? 0 fatalities, 0 deaths reported on either side. Not even one serious injury was reported on either side. So it's a bloodless beginning to the deadliest war that this nation has ever seen. But on the second day, on the 13th, the bombardment started to speed up, and it came to a close pretty quickly that afternoon. Over at Fort Moultrie, Confederate forces have changed tactics. They're no longer sending solid shot into these walls, which has been ineffective at battering them. Now they're sending a combination of shells, which are explosive, and a hot shot over the front walls of the fort. They're specifically aiming for a structure that lined the back wall or the gorge wall. And if you look back here today, you can make out some brick roofs. And if you look closely, you can make out some windowsills, some door frames left somewhat intact, and some fireplaces as well. That was at one time a 3-story officer's quarters. It was topped with a slate roof, and that roof made a perfect target for Beauregard's men. So after several attempts, they sent hot shot right through those roofs, started the woody interior of that structure on fire. As that structure burnt out, Beauregard sent his staff here one last time to ask if Anderson is ready to give up. This time Anderson finally agreed. So on the 13th, Beauregard and Anderson started to negotiate the handing over of Fort Sumter, and that would officially happen the next day on the 14th as Confederate forces start to arrive and put these fires out. On the 14th, the fort officially changed hands, and in return for Fort Sumter, Beauregard offered Anderson 2 surrender terms. The first was that all of Anderson's men could go back to New York with not a single prisoner of war taken. Before they left, they could lower their flag to a 100-cannon salute. Anderson thought these terms sounded very generous. He agreed to them. And on that day, his men started to lower their flags to their flag to their salute. Everything went just fine until the 47th round, when a private named Daniel Howe loaded his cannon. And as Private Howe took his powder cartridge and shoved it into his muzzle, it somehow ignited, prematurely exploded, and blew his right arm off at the shoulder, killing him instantly. Private Daniel Howe was the first fatality of the Civil War, this tragic accidental death after the bombardment had already ended. He is the first of at least 620,000 people, possibly 800,000 people, as new research has suggested, to die during this war. One of at least 800,000 or 600,000 people who now return home to their families at the end of the Civil War in 1865, nor witness a country that reemerges from the war. With emancipation and reunification, the United States is a very different country than what it had been in 1860 and 61. And that is where I'm going to end my talk. If you have any questions, you can stick around and ask. Otherwise, thank you all for coming out and have a good day.